Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome. Welcome to all of you joining us here in this lovely wood-paneled conference room at United Nations headquarters in New York. Welcome also to those who are following us on the United Nations webcast. Saying that to warn all of you, you're on television. Great to have you with us on this International Day for the Eradication of Poverty, and in particular for this special dialogue on human rights, participation, and extreme poverty. I think we're going to have a great discussion over the course of the next hour or so. I want to first acknowledge the excellent organizers and sponsors of today's event, beginning, of course, with the international movement ATD Fourth World, who've made it possible for all of us to come together to have this conversation. Also, the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and all of our partners from the NGO Committee for Social Development, the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, the Permanent Mission of France to the United Nations, Permanent Mission of Burkina Faso to the United Nations, and all of you who are joining us today on this International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. I'm going to remind you again that we have a hashtag. So for those of you who can't stay off of social media, please do it. Hashtag End Poverty, hashtag End Poverty Day. Anything else in the hashtag family? We'll go with those two. Hashtag End Poverty, hashtag End Poverty Day on today's dialogue. You're going to hear from a range of stakeholders today, some coming from the UN, but most importantly, people coming from inside communities that are confronting the realities of poverty and who know what the experience is about and are here to bring that expertise to the international community, to the international system, to the United Nations, and to all of us who, by our admission price of being in this room, for those of you working in international organizations, is to take the expertise that will be shared with us today and use it to break down the walls of participation in the United Nations to ensure that just as we have worked over the years to include the voices of women and minorities and migrants and indigenous peoples and so many other groups in international deliberations, that we find a way to do this also for the voices of persons living in poverty. We've got a few key objectives here. We want to see how we can get that done in practical terms. We want to see how we can build real partnerships between UN agencies at the global level, at the regional level, and importantly at the country level to work with our partners from inside communities that are confronting the realities of poverty today. So you know this is the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you have looked at that declaration, you'll know that it promises a world free from fear and free from want for all people without discrimination. And that things like healthcare and water and sanitation and housing, things like medical care, all of those sort of things are not supposed to be under the Universal Declaration, under the world order promised in the Universal Declaration. They're not supposed to be commodities for sale to those who can afford them. They're supposed to be fundamental human rights to which all human beings are entitled just by virtue of having been born human. That's the mandate of the United Nations. And if our agencies and our intergovernmental mechanisms are not set up in a way in the 21st century to accommodate the voices of those who have been denied those fundamental human rights, then we are not doing our job. UDHR 70 years ago promised in one of its articles a social and international order in which all of the rights in the Declaration can be fully realized. That's our mandate today in this conversation. How can we advance that agenda through agencies at the international system by bringing in voices of persons who know the realities of poverty on the ground? And here's, I think, the most fundamental thing. This is not a discussion about charity, because poverty is not an accident. Nowhere where poverty occurs is it an accident. It is rather the result of carefully and intentionally constructed policies and institutions and realities by those in power that disadvantage those who don't have that power. It's also, as we begin killing myths here, it's also important to remember that poverty is not in the first instance about income. That it's not about simply being denied money in your pocket. But really, from a human rights perspective, if we take the Universal Declaration seriously, poverty is about not having the security and the choices and the capabilities and the power necessary to make sure that you have a life of dignity, that you can have an adequate standard of living and all of the other human rights that are promised in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Poverty is also not some kind of enigma, some unsolvable puzzle that mankind has been struggling with forever, or humankind has been struggling with forever and has been unable to resolve. We know how to do it. We know how to eradicate poverty. And a very important first step, if you see the lapel pin on many of us here today, is the Sustainable Development Goals that sets forth a roadmap on what societies need to do to take human rights seriously, to take sustainable development seriously. We know what kinds of policies, what kinds of programs don't work. We know which ones make the situation worse, and we know which ones give us hope of actually eradicating poverty. We need to hear voices about that as well. I also want to say that the other myth that we have to look in the face is this idea that we don't have the means to eradicate poverty. Poverty is a policy choice. It's about the choices that are made on where we spend those means. There is no shortage of resources to meet what the Universal Declaration for Human Rights promises. Last year, global military expenditures were $1.7 trillion. $1.7 trillion. The average CEO pay for the largest corporations was $12.9 million. That's 380 times more than the pay of the average U.S. worker, without mentioning a worker in the garment industry in Bangladesh, for example. The money is there. And let me say, the top 6 billionaires, the top 6 guys, they're all guys, top 6 most wealthy men in the world, are worth last year their income was $530 billion. So those 6 guys made enough money last year to eradicate extreme poverty everywhere several times over. It's not an absence of resources, it's a decision on where we spend those resources. I can give you more figures as we go on in this conversation, but don't let anyone tell you that poverty is a problem that we cannot eradicate. We can, we just don't. And that is what needs to change as we are going forward. Poverty is a choice made by the powerful and imposed on the poor. That's what it is. And we need to look it in the face if we're going to change it. So 70 years after the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there should be no doubt that poverty is also a violation of internationally guaranteed human rights. It's a human rights violation, that's why we're talking about it today. Now, the technocrats, over many, many decades of work at the international level, have tried to reduce this to a much more simplistic question. Poverty is measured by $1 a day income, for example, or it's the absence of income, or the lack of access to a so-called basket of goods and services, or a lack of basic capabilities. But the interesting thing that happened at the international level is when people working on poverty programs in international financial institutions and development agencies started to ask people from the communities themselves, people living in poverty, what is this all about? The answer was not $1 a day. The answer was not limited income. What they spoke about in every instance instead was about their security. It was about the choices that they had. It was about exclusion and abuse and discrimination at the hands of public sector actors and private sector actors. It was about everyday indignities that related to the absence of power in the societies in which people live. So this is about power. This is about voice. This is about shattering all of the myths and the lies and the prejudices that are so deeply entrenched, and hearing the voices of people who actually live the reality of poverty in countries around the world. Hearing from them what the experience is, what needs to happen in that regard, and what our job is in fighting against poverty. What is it that we're expected to do as international agents, as international agencies and organizations? We want to hear that from the people themselves. So let's get to that immediately. It's the whole point of this discussion. I'm surrounded by experts from the communities who know this better than any international expert who purports to be working in poverty can know it without their voices. To get to that conversation, I want to introduce one of our hosts, Geneviève Tardieu, who's with us just off to my right here from ATD Fourth World. And Geneviève, if you could then introduce and bring us through a few brief presentations from our experts from the community. Geneviève.
Okay, thank you very much. For this wonderful introduction. So I am Geneviève Tardieu. I'm a member of ATD Fourth World, and I will be introducing our speakers for the first 15 minutes of our conference together. And then after that, we will enter in a full dialogue. But first of all, our delegates are going to share their own reflection about participation or the lack of it coming from their own lives. And we know that the experience of people living in poverty is crucial to policy making. For instance, leaving no one behind is one of the best examples that I could take. While evaluating the Millennium Development Goals, people living in poverty reacted strongly against the goal of reducing poverty by 1/2, which would leave out the most isolated people. And it's not possible to accept that. So the concept of leaving no one behind was forged by people living in poverty. And it is now the backbone of the 2030 agenda. So that means that people living in poverty can make a difference. So the first point we are going to make is that there are a lot of barriers to participation, and one of them being that people living in poverty are not expected to make meaningful contribution. So the first round of contribution will illustrate this point. So Ms. Stacy White, you have the floor to make the first point.
For me, poverty is about neglected areas where there are limited resources for our families, and we're going to continue to live like that unless we voice our opinions, unless we voice and let them hear us. It's important that we stand up for our rights and that we voice our needs, which is not going to really happen in the community that I am from. It's really hard to have everyone stand up for their needs. Like I said, we have to meet people, we have to speak with them, because just having a piece of paper with a whole bunch of names on it, as they would say, petition, that's not going to work. And it's important because it's only right. Everyone should have a right to say how they live their life and what is going on with their life and how they are being treated with their life. And as for myself, a lot of times I've had the feeling that I was not heard. As I stated, I went into the shelter and I was told I was given false information, and I was denied shelter at one time until I had to go back and I had to fight for my right to be assisted for shelter housing. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Cook?
The shelter system isn't appropriate for the homeless community.
Microphone for the speaker, please.
Homeless couples who aren't legally married can't be living together. Family shelters. Sorry. Let me start again. The shelter system isn't appropriate, and the homeless community has no say about it. There are couples that, if they're not legally married, they can't go into a shelter together. So they're living on the streets, even in the dead of winter. 17-year-old or above males, even if they're still in high school living with their family, they can't go into a shelter with them because they're male. And family shelters will not take males over the age of 17. The people say that this is just how it is. There's nothing we can do about it. The bureaucrats won't listen to us. We vote, but things aren't changing. Why are we settling for this? Why is this why aren't people crying out that this is a crime against humanity? It's degrading for everyone, even the people who walk by the homeless. How can they walk by them without, feeling something in their heart that this is wrong? How can you do that to a human being? I want to change that system. Thank you.
Mr. Safe?
I am here today to speak on behalf of Asha, Fourth World activist from Dar es Salaam. When her visa to come here was denied, she told me. People living in extreme poverty are often humiliated and disrespected. I felt that my rights were violated, that I do not have an equal opportunity to travel and belong to a large world. They told me they cannot give me a visa because of my income, and they did not believe that I would come back to my country after the event of October 17. I was very disappointed. I believed I would share my knowledge and I will share my knowledge and my experience and learn from others as well. Asha was refused a visa because her worth as a person and her human dignity did not have value. The knowledge and experience of people living in poverty are not taken into account in society and institutions. They are imprisoned, encouraged. Nobody trusts them. Nobody trusts or believes them. They have no chance to express themselves.
Thank you, Mr. Matara.
Yeah, I grew up in a very humble family in rural Kenya. I decided to remain close to children there and help to raise their voice. There are so many children who are struggling. Children go through many problems. They feel hopeless, unwanted, and useless. When I think about the farthest behind, the ones who come to mind are children who have been discriminated against, isolated, and left in the streets. They need somebody who can stand up for them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we will see now that the lack of participation has a number of negative consequences, resulting in policy that lack efficiency and coherence. So Mrs. Cook, you have the floor.
It seems like a lot of the system is built to keep people who are in poverty. You know, I said that I only got into a shelter because I showed up at the Department of Transitional Assistance office with my infant son in the middle of February. He was born the beginning of December. He was only 2 months old. And I told him I have nowhere to go. I was going to be out on the street in the middle of winter with a 2-month-old. You know, I've been in the shelter for 5 years. I went from, while I was pregnant, I was in a pregnancy shelter. And then I went to a family shelter that was out of the city. And there was no transportation. My son got sick on New Year's Day. And because there was no public transportation on holidays, I actually had to call an ambulance just to go to the doctors for my son. And that's when I said, I can't do this. I had to go to the Department of Transitional Assistance, and I told them that I had nowhere to go. And they put me into a hotel. And, you know, like I said, the hotel, it's not fit for a family to live. It's not fit for anyone to live in a hotel. How can you live in a hotel where there's no way to cook? You have a tiny fridge and just a microwave. We weren't allowed to have a stovetop. We weren't allowed to have a crock pot. It's not feasible for a family or anyone to live like that. And I was almost allowed a housing voucher, but then they found out that my last permanent residence wasn't in Boston. And because of that, they said, you can't get the voucher. So instead of giving the voucher to someone who's been in this system for, 4 years now, they decided to give it to someone else. And I'm still stuck in the shelter with my children. I was moved to a family shelter, a transitional shelter, which is great, but it's infested with mice. And that is an unhealthy living environment. My son has severe asthma, and we're living amongst mice. I've had to go out and get a cat just in order to keep the mice under control. My husband works, but we can't save up enough money to go and get an apartment. An apartment would cost us at least $2,000 for a 3-bedroom, which is what we would need because we have 3 small children. And I can't save up more than $2,000 because if I do, then any benefits I'm going to get, including my health insurance, are going to get cut off. And then what is the point of leaving the shelter if I have nothing else, if I have no insurance for my children. Thank you.
Mr. Safe?
In our country, the people in the deepest poverty do come together as themselves. The only place where they are missing is in policy making. When the policymakers plans development concerning the people who are left behind, they are not included. But they are the one who live in poverty, and they have a contribution to make and opinions about what works better for their lives. When the human rights and the dignity of everybody are taken into account, the world will have a sustainable peace and love.
Mr. Matara?
Yes, when I reached the age of going to secondary school, my mom could not afford the school fees, and it was very difficult for her to take me to school. And then I decided to go to look for my dad, who had run away from home to go to Nairobi. Then it took me 1 month and a half to find my dad in Kibera. It was a big challenge for me to find him, and he managed to take me to school. I managed to finish secondary school. After finishing, I found a friend who helped me to go to the university. If it was this somebody who paid for my fee in the university, sometimes I look back and I say, where could I have been now? So these are the well-wishers in the society that we have, who are ready to help somebody who is very needy. And we believe somebody from poverty, education is the only key that can transform our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Safe, you have also another point about education.
Thank you again. We are facing the same problem in my country. Again, Asha was one of the good students, despite her poverty and struggle. However, her mother had to advise her to fail the national exam. She was worried about the cost for secondary school because she was alone, because of the loneliness of the extreme poverty they were facing. In my country, if a child passes the national exam and the parents do not bring him or her to secondary school, they could go to jail. And it is also a shame. It is also a source of shame for parents if their child passes the exam and they don't bring them to the secondary school. What other choice did Asha's mother have? You see that poverty also forces you to make choice that you know not for what you want for yourself and your family.
Thank you, Mr. Safe. Now we are going to see that in spite of all the barriers, people who live in poverty build relationships. They reach out to the poorest within their communities, and they forge very valuable partnerships. And there is also a lot to learn from that. So, Mrs. Cook.
Thank you. I volunteer at there's a couple of churches in our city that they have lunch and dinner programs and art programs. The art program is actually a great opportunity for the homeless because they come together, they work on their own art, and then they are given the chance to sell this art to make some money, enough to get themselves a cup of coffee or to get them something to eat that night. They take clothing donations, and, these people have become my family. They know that they can count on me, I can count on them. We support each other, and that's how we get through every day, is because we know that there is someone else that's going through this with us, and we can rely on each other, and we know we can trust each other. you know, because we do know what that other person is going through. You know, my children know these people as friendly faces, as family. We see any of the ones that we're really close to, and my children will go up and hug them. They call them auntie and uncle because to them, that's their family. That's their extended family. They're people that they know they can trust. If anything ever happened, I know I could go to them, and they would be there for me and my children. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Safe?
People who live in poverty are not beggars. They do come to they don't complain. They don't come forward and say, I need help. Often they work hard. They do their best to hide their poverty, to make sure they wear clean clothes. It is a way of defending themselves. So how can they be reached by a protection system? It is not enough to ask through a survey if your house is made of mud or metal sheet. To know who are the poorest of a community, the people know themselves. They can say who should be helped and what are the right question to be asked. We support one another, but we lack the means to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Safe. You are right. People living in poverty know who are the poorest of the poor in their community. And Mr. Matara, you are going to show us how you engage yourself into meeting with the poorest of the poor. Please.
Yes. There is a group that I volunteer with in Kibera. I've been working there for, this is now 8 years down the line. One day, a group of children that we work with came to us and they reported a certain girl who is not going to school. And we decided to visit their family, and we realized this girl, she's mentally disabled. And the mother was not proud of her. Sometimes they hide these kind of children. So what we did when we went to their family and we wanted to talk about this issue, the parent was not that open to us because it was our first time. But the second round when we went there, we created that bondage and friendship. Through that friendship, that is the time she started opening up. Then we connected her with another organization that is in Kibera that's dealing with children who are mentally disabled. After that, she took the girl to the center. On the same line, before that, her dad had died while this girl was 7 years old. After she had died, the mother went to a clinic for a checkup, and it was diagnosed that she's positive, her and with her daughter, who was 16 years now. The doctor wanted to take the daughter, but the mother didn't want. She was not trustful to the doctor. When she realized that she's positive, she was very depressed because of people in the community and how they stopped talking to her, stigmatization. Through time and friendship, that's how we connected her with another center. When we found out that this girl, she has been abused for a long time, we reported this case to the police, and the police had to arrest the man, and now the man is behind the bars. This girl and her mother are kind of people who have been left behind. We must be friends and to the marginalized so that we can access their rights. Thank you very much.
Okay, and to finish with, we are going to show you how it's possible to have people living in poverty enter into participatory process. So we have the example of the Fourth World People's University and also participatory action research about education. So, Mrs. White, you are going to tell us about the Fourth World People's University. Thank you.
Thank you. ATD Fourth World provides a safe space for people in poverty to speak about our lives. That is the Fourth World People's University. There we learn a lot about our rights, and we get comfortable enough to speak with one another, and we feel that people have empathy there. Everyone speaks honestly, and there are a lot of us that who are in poverty feel that we are somebody when we go there. For myself, I can say they gave me a lot of courage to speak today. I encourage so many people to join, and this is a place where everyone has a voice. I'm part of the planning team for the People's University. We prepare monthly meetings. We choose one topic. It can be homelessness or education. We choose activities to help people express themselves, like icebreakers and forum theaters. We send out invitations. We reach out to people living in poverty. We invite a guest who can discuss with us on our topic. We are together with people from different walks of life, but we all have the heart to reach out to those who are living in poverty. We learn a lot from each other. This is a give and take situation. I have gained the right to be heard. It has helped me deal with a lot outside as well. I know that I can speak up and say, it's not fair what is happening. You get so much respect when you speak up for yourself. It's true for me, and it's true for many others. People's University is a true place of participation.
Thank you very much, Ms. White. So we are going to finish with the experience of Mr. Safe, who is going to tell you about this participatory action research in which he was involved in his own country, Tanzania.
Thank you very much. In order to achieve our goal of eradicating extreme poverty, participation is necessary, and the people with a direct experience of poverty are the central stakeholders. They have great ideas, suggestions, and opinions for achieving goals. When they can merge their knowledge with practitioners and academics, the results become complete and no one is left behind. It allows all citizens, all communities, to actively participate in the development of their community or country. Participation allows everyone to be aware of what is happening in the community, and it makes people feel proud. For example, in Tanzania, ATD Fourth World conducted successful participatory research on education for all with the people who have a direct experience of poverty. All primary schools involved have seen positive change. In the past, those schools did not have a good communication with between teachers, parents, and the students, but now they do. And it makes it very easy for the children to love to learn. This research involved all stakeholders: teachers, parents, students, local authorities, and education officers. And also, at the end, we got successful impacts. Participation builds up courage, confidence, and knowledge. It expands ideas and also the capacity to make appropriate decisions. To leave no one behind, we need to include all in every step of the design, implementation, and evaluation of policies. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Genevieve, and thanks to all of our community activists who have joined us today. I have to say I'm sort of looking at everything through the lens of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights these days. And, you know, what really struck me here is, as I hear intervention from Stacey, talking about whole neglected areas, the lack of voice, the lack of, and even when there is a pretense of voice, not necessarily being heard. In meaningful ways, the importance of community outreach. You know, it makes me think about the right to free, active, and meaningful participation, this fundamental human right that says that not only do you have a right to participate, but it has to make a difference, your participation. It can't just be some sort of, you know, pro forma exercise. And Kim talking about the experience of shelters, and very low standards in those shelters, and the lack of listening bureaucrats, and the indignities of homelessness. And then we see that the Universal Declaration promises a right to adequate housing. The international human rights instruments say that it's not just to stick somebody in a hotel, but you have to be able to cook meals for your family safely and in a dignified way. And Saleh, and also in the words that he shared from Asha as well, you know, the idea that somebody would be denied a visa to travel because of their financial, their material, what they have in their pocket or in their bank account is a direct breach of the first line of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It says all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, that there's no price tag attached to it. And Patrick emphasizing the rights of the child. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is the UN instrument with the most ratifications. Every country in the world, except one, who wants to guess, has ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and here we see direct breach of that. And then Kim again, talking about how the system is designed to keep people in poverty, and then if you make progress, you're penalized for it. Where is the idea of progressive realization of economic and social rights codified in international law? The right to adequate housing, again, you know, coming up in her comments. Elahe, talking about the lack of possibilities to make choices about your own life. That's self-determination. Or Patrick on the right to education, which is supposed to guarantee free education. Free education. It's not a commodity for sale to the rich or those who can afford to pay. Salahe on school fees also, but also on stigma and shame, the lack of choices. Kim again on the power of people, how that can be unleashed if persons who are living in poverty can be allowed to be active participants in their own communities, in their own societies, as the Human Rights Declaration promises that they should be. Salahe on the invisibility of some people living in poverty, who have to suffer in silence, and the limited reach of protection systems to get to those folks. Patrick, you know, again, making us think about intersectionality here as he tells stories about people living in poverty who have family members with disabilities, family members with girls who are subjected to sexual abuse in that case, survivors of sexual abuse, HIV, the intersectionality of all of those forces that manifest themselves in experience of poverty, and how we all have to make sure that all of this is factored in. And then Stacey, again, giving us an example of the power, I think, that comes when institutions give people voice, when there's real community outreach, school programs, and the kinds of things that make a difference in people's lives. So then the question becomes, for everybody in this room, and I'm going to open up the floor now to include many of the other participants who are in the room as well. We have a number of international institutions represented here today: the Office of the President of the Economic and Social Council, the permanent missions of Burkina Faso and of France, the United Nations Development Program, the United Nations Development and Economic and Social Issues Department, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, UNICEF, the UN Children's Fund, the NGO major groups, and of course ATD Fourth World. So, you know, we've all been listening to what we've heard over the course of the last several minutes, and we have to now see how we can turn this valuable information into change in our own institutions. How it is that we can access these things and make sure that different UN states. Can you imagine a situation in which you had an international institution talking about, suppose it was ECOSOC, and you're having a discussion about the rights of women, and you have no women on the panel? is that a credible exercise? And so it is with indigenous peoples, and so it is with any of the other stakeholders that we have learned to interact with. How do we make that happen for persons who live in poverty and their advocates? How can all UN stakeholders be brought into the tent? How can we have changed the way that we grant consultative status to people to make sure that persons who are living in poverty have a seat at the table to bring these real-world lessons and the voice of their communities into what the UN does? What are the obstacles to that participation? And how can those be overcome? The SDGs, the 2030 Agenda, is an agenda which is built upon this idea of real participation from all of these communities. So you have a 21st century idea of participation, but the institutions of the UN for participation are mid-20th century mechanisms for participation. How can we drag those mechanisms kicking and screaming into the 21st century by bringing into the tent the people that are supposed to be our real partners on these questions? So let me bring that back to you, and this is an open discussion for all of our participants, but in particular, maybe hear from some of the UN voices on your ideas and how this resonates and what we can do to make sure that these voices are a normal part of our work. Yes. Oh, and I'm sorry, I should have said we didn't do name introductions all the way around when we started, so I'll ask you as you intervene, introduce give your name and your affiliation, and then your intervention. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Wenyan Yang. I work in the Division for Inclusive Social Development in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the Secretariat of the UN. I want to thank all of you for your contribution, and not only for today. I mean, today obviously is a highlight, a high moment in everybody's work and in the daily struggles and the challenges you face, that today there's this opportunity to actually be acknowledged and to have your voice heard. I think it is I believe it's a high for all of us, and for me personally it's always very inspiring to be part of the International Day celebration. And also, I think more importantly, I really want to express my own personal, but I think I can speak for my departments as well, to thank you for all the work you do every day, the other 365 days, how many days? the rest of the year, every day what you do, and truly you are inspirations, and you are what we are here for. And I think that this is something that I personally feel really very strongly about this, and I do think I have the confidence to speak on behalf of my department for that, and to thank you and really appreciate what you have done. And also, I also want to thank Greg for this very, very nice wrap-up, kind of summary of the highlights of what we have heard just now, the ideas, the challenges that people face every day. Allow me to come from the development side. As Greg said, he was seeing everything from the angle of human rights. I'm from the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. I come from the development side. Not to say that we don't meet. We actually do meet. From a development point of view, I think we have been, that the UN system has been promoting inclusive, sustainable, social, economic development for all. I think for all, that's the key word, that nobody should be left behind. Development is not for just few people, not for the 1%, the few very rich gentlemen who can eradicate extreme poverty several times over. It's for everybody, for all of us. In this sense, the UN development system as a whole have been promoting very much the approach to development that is integrating the economic, social, environment aspect of development, and human rights is at the foundation of such an approach to development. At the same time, realization of development is fundamental and indispensable for the progressive realization of human rights. Without I think that I don't have to say that, the people who are here, you know very well from your daily experience, living in poverty is very much at the root cause of the denial of your fundamental rights. So that eradication poverty to promote sustainable, inclusive development for all is at the root of confronting the violation of human rights for people living in poverty. And the other points I want to make is that we have been very much emphasizing not only development is for all, development should be by all as well. So we very much promote this participatory approach to development, to decision making. I think that really addresses what we have heard, that, as Kim was saying, as if the system of social assistance is designed to keep people in poverty. That's wrong. That's because the system, when the system was designed, people who were living in poverty, people who are supposed to be benefiting from such a system were not there. So their challenges, their voices were not heard. So that in this sense, I think that we definitely are on the same page. We are together for this to win this fight. And I just want to mention before I let other people join the dialogue is that the UN system has drafted a system-wide action plan for the eradication of poverty in the context of implementing the third United Nations decade for the eradication of poverty. This third decade starts this year, and then 10 years that's supposed to end in 2027, just before the deadline of the 2030 agenda. In there are 10 principles for this system-wide plan of action. I just want to mention a few that's I think, highly relevant. One is respect for internationally recognized human rights is an essential foundation for action for the UN system. And another principle, inclusion and empowerment of those being left behind is a priority, targeting those furthest behind. So this is behind everything the UN system, the UN development system is supposed to do. So this is a very important principle. Let me also mention one of the other principles of the 10 principles is the inclusive and strategic partnerships based on these principles that will pull together resources and deliver action globally, regionally, nationally, and locally. I think locally is where Stacy were mentioning, right? So at the community level, we need to have people heard and the neglected areas being attended to. So that I just want to mention that. And then just to conclude, we also, in terms of areas of priority for policy intervention, one of the very important areas is expanding social protection system to support people living in poverty and to empower people living in poverty. And second priority area for policy intervention is the human capacity development. We were talking about the critical importance of education. Access to education is right there. It's one of the priority areas in the UN system-wide action plan. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Wenyan. That's Wenyan from DESA. Let's go over. I know that we're really pushing the time, so I hope we'll have some flexibility. I'm going to keep going until somebody stops us. Let's go over to this side of the room now.
Hi, my name is Rosemary. I'm with the United Nations Development Program. I'm very, very happy to be here, and thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and stories. When I was listening to you, I was thinking, actually, I have a lot in common with you. I'm not poor, but certainly many of the experiences you talked about, whether it is regarding sexual abuse or mental illness, lack of empowerment for youth, those are all stories that are very familiar to our families. And there's a lot more that we have in common with each other than divides. But somehow poor people are somehow considered to be different, right? There is that stigma. And I think that for me personally, this opportunity to have a dialogue not only on a designated day, but more regularly, more systematically is critical. And Craig, I take your point that we somehow need to institutionalize it in the way we work. So I do see signs of that happening in the UN Development Program. For us, most of our dialogue with the people we work with happens at the country level, not in New York, right? And so at the moment, we're really looking at the way our country offices operate and trying to see how we can change the way we work to give much greater voice to all sorts of stakeholders, to all sorts of colleagues, not just government. For us, government have been our key counterpart. The second, Craig mentioned the importance of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I also hold the title of Lead Advisor on the Sustainable Development Goals at UNDP. And one of the best things that has happened because of the goals agenda is that it includes an explicit focus on leaving no one behind and starting with those furthest left behind first. And so that gives us a license to say to our government counterparts, actually, we are going to focus on this particular community in that particular region or this group that has a certain characteristic that you may not be interested in, but you signed up to the agenda. So unlike the Convention on the Rights of the Child, everyone signed up to the SDGs. So that gives us a powerful entry point. The next point I want to make is that we also have begun, or rather I am pushing very strongly, focusing much more at the subnational level. So at the moment, we tend to talk about countries, right? Increasingly, we're talking about what do we do in a particular state? What do we do in a particular city as more and more people migrate to cities? What is the link between the big city, the smaller city, and the rural area from which families have migrated, right? So that sort of subnational focus is very important. Another point is what kinds of data do we have? How do we count and measure people who are poor, right? So Craig talked about looking at poverty beyond income, beyond looking at capabilities, access to health and water and education and so on. But the kind of data that official statistics agencies of the government have typically look at income, and typically they are there's a big lag. So at the moment, we could still be talking about poverty rates from 2014 or 15, even though we're reaching the end of 2018. So do we have new sources of data based maybe on mobile phone use, right? Or from satellite data that looks at the amount of electricity there is in villages across countries and across the globe that can tell us where poor people live, right? So there are many different things we can do, and we are really trying to do that much more systematically, as someone says, in an integrated way. And the last point I want to make is the role of the state. We can't get away from that, right? Governments, the states are responsible for providing essential services. And sometimes we are not strong enough to say to them, this is your responsibility. Why should it be that if you lose your health care, you immediately slide back into poverty, even though you might have come out of it 5 years ago, right? Kim, you talked about losing all your benefits if you make more than $2,000. We say people have to get a job. The minute they get a job, they lose their childcare benefits, right? So these are the kinds of policy issues that we need to begin thinking about much better. I think we do a fairly decent job, but obviously we haven't solved the problems yet. So in closing, I want to thank you for the kinds of issues that you have put on the table and for encouraging us to take a closer, franker look at the kind of work we do.
Thank you very much, Rosemary from UNDP, and you've got my head buzzing about poverty rates, which I think are, I spoke about lies and myths in my original tirade here. Poverty rates are so often an exercise in obfuscation, in actually hiding the reality of the numbers of poverty. The first example of that was the $1 a day measure, which hid huge numbers of people who were living in poverty, and that issue of invisibility that came up relates so much also to data. Others ready to? Yes, please.
Sorry, if there are no others, I'll happily take the floor. My name is Daniel Perel, and I'm chair of the NGO Committee on Social Development and organizing partner of the NGO Major Group, at least titled here. And I'm happy to be listed under ambassador and UN representative. I don't know which I am. So I wanted, thank you. I wanted to make just 5 hopefully quick points. And I'm expressing gratitude very much to those who have come from so far, both geographically and socially, in fact, to come into this space. It's quite a distinct kind of place, and I know it's a high barrier to entry, so I'm grateful to you for coming. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is qualitative versus quantitative data. We have a lot of quantitative data, and often we rely upon that. But if I were to quantitatively describe a baby to you, it wouldn't really make a difference to your heart until you saw the quality of that baby. And so I think what you're presenting here is a little bit of that side of the issue that we're working on that speaks more to the qualitative soul of the issue. And I'm grateful to you for that. Secondly is the blind man and the elephant. I'm sure you're all familiar with this analogy. And I fear that often policymakers are those who stand at the tusk, which is the most beautiful, most valuable part of the elephant, and they try to make policy related to the other parts of the elephant. And there are parts that they can see and analyze, but there are parts that they can't even see. And you need people who are at maybe the less flattering parts of the elephant to be in the room to talk about what it's actually like there, rather than just relying on the tusk-type folks to make that analysis for them. Another thing is that there's a catch-22 in this process where often decision makers, policymakers don't want to listen to those who are living in poverty or are otherwise marginalized because they don't feel they have the capacity to express themselves in ways that are, in the similar language. And yet the reason they may lack that capacity, firstly, I don't know that they lack the capacity, but the reason that they may lack the capacity or are perceived to lack it is because of the education system that they have been subject to. So it's actually, again, how the system is working against you. So systemically, one does not get the quality education to advocate for one's needs, and then you are said, well, you can't advocate for your needs because you're not well educated enough. But it's a problem that we really have to fight against, and what those of us who are at the tusk need to do is really try our best to understand we have to take that initiative. It's easier for those who were born in higher income families. It's easier for us to take that step and be generous and understanding of the other. 2 more things. One is it's not just that we need to eradicate poverty so that people have money to live and contribute, but it's also that those who are living in poverty have so much to offer in terms of lessons in generosity, in resilience, in kindness, in love, in selflessness, that I think people, at least in my higher income neighborhood, seem to have lost. I mean, there's a dimension of community that comes out of collective struggle that I think high income individuals such as myself may have lost a little bit. And so I would like to learn more, and I think we all should be learning more from those who live in poverty. And finally, a challenge perhaps to the UN system. If the agenda is truly universal, the SDG agenda, I'm wondering when high-income countries are going to open up UN offices to acknowledge that they too need development assistance. And I know it's not a traditional sort of approach, but I would love to see UN offices in actually 193 countries rather than just those who are considered to be developing, because we all have much developing to do. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And it just reminds me of the SDGs are universal. They apply in Brooklyn as much as they apply in Botswana. And that means that the UN and all of our institutions, including NGO partner committees and all of the agencies, have to adapt to reflect that. We can't wait until we have, obviously, country offices in every country. That needs to be done now. We're just going to totally ignore the time until someone kicks us out of here. I'm going to swing over to this side of the room now, and we'll try to get in as many of these as we can.
Thank you, Craig. My name is Leslie Wade. I'm also with DESA. Our office supports the presidency of the Economic and Social Council, and I'm sorry the president could not be here. She really felt quite ill this afternoon after she spoke to you earlier. So I want to thank all of you for sharing your experiences with us today. Really, your interventions demonstrate that poverty can take many, many forms and dimensions, and we must understand poverty dynamics and reorient policies to, in that regard. We do know policies can be changed. It's clear, as Rosemary said, that we need to prioritize extreme poverty, and the 2030 agenda gives us a roadmap to do that. And she has already mentioned, I think, a few remarks on what is being done, including at the field. The President mentioned, I think, this morning that, of course, the theme for next year's high-level political forum on sustainable development is about empowering people, and, of course, very relevant for the discussion here today. And the SDGs that will be reviewed include education, which was mentioned, includes economic growth, decent work, inequality, and strong institutions and peaceful societies and partnerships, all critical to addressing poverty reduction. But just to take off a little bit on what Craig said about the importance of having a seat at the table, that is very key. Participation is indispensable. But, I'm glad we have, I think, a couple of member states in the room, or representatives of member states. Political pressure is what is required, I'm afraid. And yes, we do have within ECOSOC the platform for NGOs. ECOSOC grants consultative status to give all stakeholders a room at the table, but even within the development space, decision-making on who gets a seat is highly political. And so a lot of political work has to be done, and that is really going to be indispensable. The indigenous community worked for a long time, for many, many years, to get a seat at the table. There's now a permanent forum on indigenous issues in ECOSOC. They succeeded, so I think there is some hope. Thank you.
I mean, that's a very concrete recommendation that Leslie made here, which is that, maybe we need a permanent forum. We need a dedicated institution. And I'm going to quote that to Leslie and also to the president of the Economic and Social Council. But I think that's exactly what we're trying to get to here. What are the specific things that we can do to try to move toward a more institutionalized way of involving the voices of persons living in poverty? I'm going to now ask for all interventions to be very staccato, because we're working on borrowed time now, and I want to get in as many voices as we can. Yes.
Thank you, Greg. Donald Lee. I'm with the International Committee for October 17th. I think the experience of somebody coming for an October 17th commemoration at the UN, it's often quite, oftentimes you hear they're coming back with the feedback, it's the best event that they've ever been to. And it's because you hear people speaking from their heart. There are no airs about the people who've come to speak to you today. They speak from the heart. They tell you what's the truth. They're not going to hold back the truth. They're not going to spare you. But at the same time, we tend to forget that these aren't the only commemorations that are happening around the world. We have 52 replicas of the commemorative stone in Paris. The stone at the UN in the garden, that's only one of them. And that came 5 years after that first stone was inaugurated. So today, around the world, you have hundreds and hundreds of these gatherings, not in the same form or nature, but they're taking place and people are talking to one another. And so that's that dialogue. So I think, let me jump to the chase, cut to the chase, and I think President ECOSOC suggestion, let's get a group together to meet with her before HLPF with a few key ambassadors. Let's get that dialogue going. When the President ECOSOC travels and she goes around the world, when she gets to a place where we can help and facilitate a dialogue with people living in poverty, let's do that. Let's keep in touch. I think that's the third proposal I have is in 2006 we had a review of the contribution of the commemoration each year for the participation of people living in poverty. I think it's about time we had another review. I think that DESA carried out the first study in 2006. We can do another one to see just what that impact is, how we get people together when they come together on October 17th. And just to give you an example that people living in poverty can really make an impact, there is a study that's going on with Oxford University, the World Bank, onto the multidimensional aspects of poverty. And you've had 7, 8 teams around the world who've actually contributed just from people living in poverty. Thank you.
I think that's fantastic, and you've definitely earned your ticket with all of those suggestions, which I'm recording here. The one thing I think and I'm going to take a couple more here, we recently have gone through a real soul-searching exercise in the UN looking at accessibility for persons with disabilities and realized that we're not in the 21st century when it comes to that issue as well. And one of the initial things that always came up was we would say, we'd make proposals and then the answer would be, okay, yeah, when you're having a meeting on the issue of disabilities, then we'll make sure it's accessible. And then we had to say, no, that's not, the point is not only to have persons with disabilities at meetings about disabilities, it's about making everything accessible to women and men, to young and older, to persons with disabilities, to others, and so the question then is, how do we make sure that everything we do, not only things on poverty, not only this one day a year, which is so important, but throughout the deliberations and the programs and the policies of the UN, the voices of that very significant portion of the world population who are people living in poverty, that their voices are there when the discussion is health or education or prisons or housing or political participation or security or development or human rights, whatever it is, how to make sure that happens. Let me take a couple more very brief interventions. Yes, please.
Very brief. Hi. Thank you so much. I'm Sol. I'm a social policy specialist from UNICEF, so the United Nations Children's Fund. Thank you all for sharing your voices today. Shamefully, I work on child poverty for the past 12 years, and opportunities like these are very few. And I work on child poverty research and policy advocacy. And we should be doing much more of this. And I think a common thread with all 4 of you is you were all either born into poverty as children or you have children yourselves, and you're worried about their future. And the fact is, poverty affects children in significant ways. It affects their education, health, nutrition, and so forth. And children are way more likely to be in poverty than adults. More than half of extreme poverty, where they look at $1.90, or multidimensional poverty, more than half of it is children, while they all only comprise 30% of the world's population. So it disproportionately affects children, and this is something we really need to take to heart. Participation is one of the main foundations of the Convention of the Rights of the Children, but we have to admit it's often there on paper. We bring children to conferences and so forth, but that's where it stops often. We don't have true participation of children. And the experts in child poverty are children themselves. The experts on poverty are people in poverty. It's not me, it's you. So I'm very thankful for this opportunity to talk to you today, to hear your voices, your stories. And I take this to heart because I work on poverty research, and I should be doing more to involve people who are in poverty in this research. So thank you.
Thank you, Solrun from UNICEF, for everything that you're doing over there and for that comment. Okay, so I think we've been full circle, so maybe we can start coming back to our experts again if anyone wants to make a final. Sorry, did I miss somebody? Oh, I'm so sorry. You're not in my peripheral vision there. Please, go ahead.
Thank you. No, you're welcome. I also have a peripheral vision issue, so I understand that perfectly. Just in a few quick words, I am Hayat Zegar. I work at the French mission to the UN, and I am in charge of health and social development issues. And actually, it's as the French ambassador told this morning, as you know, we try to build and to strengthen a strong the link between human rights and social development. That's why, for example, I think with Japan, we are the only mission with an expert or counselor who is in charge of these issues wherever it is. In development commissions or human rights, I follow social issues, health issues, poverty issues. And because we strongly think that it's a human rights issue and a development issues, and both at the same time. Just to share with you the strong conviction that participation and your participation and the participation of many other people in any of our debates here at the UN is very important, because practically I participate to negotiations or events about poverty or health issues, and so we negotiate texts, words, and it can be sometimes a risk that we forget the realities and the people behind these words. And it's always a risk in any bureaucracy, in any place. But here the risk is even higher because we work at the global level with so many different realities between member states, many social and political different realities. So it's even more important here than in any member state that your participation is organized. And to be honest, and Geneviève and Atelier Fourth World, that I know quite well in France, they know that I used to work on the ground, and it's kind of sometimes it gives a kind of vertigo here because we are sometimes too far of the ground. Everybody knows that. We suffer from that, and I think we need you to try to avoid this risk. So just ending saying that like everyone here, obviously I wanted to thank you for your testimonies, it takes some courage to come here and to share your experience, your personal experience, and the people you know. So I kind of admire what you did today, and I hope that you will do it again once we have organized this participation.
Thank you, Hayat, for saying at the end there what we've all been thinking. So thanks for that very much, and thanks to everything that you and your colleagues at the French mission have been doing to keep this issue alive at the United Nations. That France has played a remarkable role in that regard. Can we really push our luck and take a few comments from our experts? As I said, I'm going to keep going until someone stops me. Let me kick it back to our panel of experts who have traveled here to be with us, and maybe starting with Patrick. If there's any final words you'd like to make before we conclude?
Yeah, for me, I think eradicating poverty needs our participation all. And my appeal to this panel is that if we can push for the policymakers in our countries, like in Kenya, to have good policies that is going to make sure that everybody is included. One thing that is making Africa to wallow in poverty, it's bad leadership. For example, you find a president is more richer than the country itself. So it's so unfair to others. If you could decide to take less for everybody to have enough, we'll be in a good environment. And I think everybody is going to enjoy all the benefits that is there. It's a goodwill for everyone. If you want to end something, we have that goodwill. We can do it. And I believe that we are heading to the right direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Just continuing in this direction. Kim, did you have something?
Yeah, one of the things that, when I was talking to my Fourth World ATD contacts when we were preparing me for this, they asked about the whole 2000 savings thing, and, they asked if I had any idea. And I mean, honestly, why is it we can have bank accounts? Why can't we have a specific bank account that literally cannot be counted against us, but used to save money to get out of poverty? It's something we can't touch, so it's not accessible money, but it's money we can use to get us out of poverty, to prevent that. As far as like poverty, I've known poverty my whole life. I know that my grandparents were poverty stricken. That's all I've ever known. But I also know that my mother was a very hardworking woman who literally ran herself into the ground to provide. Even when I was an adult child, she was there for me, trying to help me. You know, we were all poverty stricken, and as an adult, I was still poverty stricken, and she was giving everything she had to help me. You know, why is it like this? Why can't there be special accommodations like that to help these people that are in poverty? I'm not saying that we have to keep these accounts forever and always be listed as poverty, but if you let us have these accounts, we could get out of poverty, and then, you know, then we won't have that issue anymore. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Kim. Very well said. Salehe.
Thank you very much. What I would like to say today is that there should be a way that allows people with a direct experience of poverty to participate. So we shall look again and make sure that those barriers, you know, are taken out. Because if we only look wealth or money, income, many people will be left out. Because people are in poverty, honest, they cannot invent, they cannot prepare something which is not there. So they have to be true. So by being honest, so that they are left behind. So it is very important to find a way that when there is necessary for them to participate, it should not be barrier. It should not be a wall for them, because they do have something to share in the international institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the reasons we need to have these conversations is because, you know, some of those barriers are very visible. Some of those barriers are very visible. Some of them are invisible, right? There are a lot of barriers that are not evident to somebody peering in from the outside, and we won't know what those are unless we have these kinds of conversations. Stacey.
Yes, excuse me. I think that participation with people in poverty is awesome. It would be great if we were included in the statistics and the plannings and everything. I myself, although I am do live in poverty, I more feel so that poverty, like it's extreme poverty, as I've met these two gentlemen this past weekend, and it's made me feel as if I am, you know, compared to what's going on in their countries, I feel like I am rich. So honestly, at this moment right now, I am not thinking of myself. And I think that we should more, well, maybe you guys, you know, but we should more or less work on the international poverty, more the extreme, because that is extreme poverty. You know, and I spoke to him, and, you know, my children, my grandchildren and children, we have clean water. You know, the children, you know, I've seen pictures of children drinking out of streams of dirty water, children playing in glass areas, and, you know, that's extreme poverty. Like, I think that should be, you know, I'm going off the bend with this, but I think that should be top priority. You know, I know I'm local, and I know that a lot of people will probably give me flack out of, oh, well, we have poverty up here, and we have this, and we have that. But we also have this extreme poverty that's going on in these countries, and it's really out of control. And I believe that it should be top priority. Poverty should be top priority, but extreme poverty going on in these countries needs to be top priority. Like, I'm fine with being, you know, at the bottom rung, working with these men, you know, if this is done before me, I'm fine, you know, because I do strongly believe that I can climb out of the poverty that I am in because of the United States, because we have so many opportunities here. So I know I can do it. You know, it may take a little time, it might have, my voice has to be heard, but I don't believe that they can do it on their own like we can in the United States. So I really would like to advocate for these countries that's as Kenya, Tanzania, and all the other countries that these children are going through this, in these countries. So I would just like to, would like to ask the United Nations to have them as your top priority. Thank you.
You know, Stacey, what I've learned about you in one day is that you are one of the most empathetic people I've seen. You are always trying to shift the focus on taking care of others, and I think that's a real inspiration for all of us. I heard your presentation earlier today, which was very much focused on you reaching out to other people in the community to help them. You're doing it again today in a global level. I know you do it outside your community as well. Plenty of people in Flint, Michigan, and West Virginia who don't have access to clean water and so on. But I think that you have helped us get to the heart of this, which is this massive failure of empathy that allows what in the end is systematic and gross violations of human rights here and around the world. And I think if more people thought like you did about reaching out, helping the other one, we'd be able to overcome this much more quickly. We've had a remarkable set of shared experiences, ideas, and recommendations. We've taken a half step forward in looking at what the UN can do to make sure that we are an institution that is accessible at the global level, the regional level, and the country level, to make sure that the voices of people who are on the front lines and who know best what the experience of poverty means are actually factored in at every step in that process, that we are hearing them in all of this. We've even got some suggestions that relate to how we can make sure that these kinds of voices are included in pre-ECOSOC consultations by the President, the Bureau, and others. How UN country teams can use their convening power to open up space for consultations with people living in poverty in all the countries around the world where they operate. The suggestion of a structural review of the modalities for these discussions that have happened here. How maybe the NGO committees can also find a way to create space in there for the voices of persons living in poverty and their advocates as well. What we haven't done yet is thought about how to really fundamentally change those institutions that decide, whether there is free, active, and meaningful participation of persons living in poverty in the General Assembly, in the Economic and Social Council, in the Human Rights Council, in the high-level political forum on the Sustainable Development Goals. It's ironic that that doesn't exist for the main SDG mechanism. We need to find ways to do that, maybe building on notions of major groups and other sorts of mechanisms. I think the first step toward that is to keep this conversation going. We have a list of participants here, and everybody on this list of participants I know is going to go back to their agencies and say, what can we do to institutionalize this reality and to bring the voices of people with this experience and this expertise and this willingness to sacrifice their time, like their days aren't already busy enough, to actually come here into this big glass tower and to share with us what they know about these situations. How can we make that a part of the everyday business of the agencies in which we operate? I think we're lucky to have ATD Fourth World to stay on the case. I think we can all, ourselves included in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, pledge to keep that conversation going and to see how we can institutionalize that and follow up on everything that's that's been talked about with us today. So I think that is the final word. What we need to do is to keep the conversation going, not just on social media, #EndPoverty, #EndPovertyDay, but also in these conference rooms, also within our agencies, and we'll be checking in with the representatives in this room to see how we can support each other in doing so, together with the experts that we've all met today and who have brought so much to this conversation. 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights promise that all of us should be free from fear and want without discrimination. That means talking to each other. That means having these kinds of conversations. That means the partnerships that you see in this room. So thank you all for participating today, and we look forward to keeping this conversation alive. Thank you very much.